Okay, welcome to session number, and now I've got to go looking. Session number 18 of an introduction to biblical prophecy. Today's section will look at uh, one theme in all of biblical prophecy that keeps popping up, particularly in the Old Testament prophets. But the fact that it's repeated in the New Testament and fits into the pattern that we have already discovered, looking at Daniel and looking at the covenant structure of the Old Testament, uh, helps us to see that this little theme carries a lot of weight. What I'm talking about is a thing that we call the Day of the Lord. And I'm just going to share the screen here. Let's see if this works, because I don't always make things work. And we have liftoff. So the term the day of the Lord or the day of Yahweh, sometimes that day or a day of God's vengeance, something like that. There are a number of ways of saying it, but the phrase "the day of the Lord" is the official name of the pattern, and we find this mostly in the Old Testament prophets, and there we find it hundreds of times. A notion of the end time, when there is a blessing for the just and a curse on the unjust. So the pattern, an old pattern, goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, that there's a standard that mankind must meet, whether that's avoid eating this particular fruit in the garden or something more complex. There's a standard that we must meet that can only be met by the redeemed. Salvation and the ongoing kingdom program of redemption and kingdom programs are going to be hand in hand with this. And there's a promise of a blessing for those who meet the standard and a curse for those who do not. And that blessing can take the form of earthly happiness and prosperity. It also can take the form of redemption itself, and a redeemed society that is happy and prosperous. There are a number of ways that we can look at this, a number of ways that we see it working out, but the pattern of blessing is a long developed biblical promise. The opposite of that, the curse or judgment, is also a common pattern. It's a common theme all the way through Old Testament and into the New Testament. And the book of Revelation completes it with a final blessing for the redeemed and resurrected in the eternal state, and a judgment and utter destruction of the lost. There's a symmetry in the Bible, and the day of the Lord is a part of that symmetry. The central feature of the prophets, this day of the Lord phrase and similar phrases, comes up several hundred times. I didn't count them because it comes up so often. And in many places, it comes up in similar phrases. That day. Well, which day is that? Well, that day with a capital G. Uh, we see that so often that we have to ask ourselves, why does this keep coming up, and why does it appear to be so important? it's obviously a key theme that looks forward to the culmination or the completion of history. So the day of the Lord is central to the end time events, but along the way, it's going to have some other implications. So a study of history is obviously going to help us understand this. As I introduce this concept, I'm going to have to say that this is far too big for one or two lessons here. It's really a very large thing. And after I introduce it today and perhaps next week, we're going to be looking at some other spots in Old Testament prophecy. And I think you'll see how this repeats itself. It keeps popping up. And so those who argue that there is no earthly judgment coming, and there is no blessing of a millennial kingdom coming. Those things are all fulfilled in the church age. Have a problem because the Bible is so clear on this. Something that I have noticed over time is that most of those who hold that the church fulfills the prophecies for Israel, and that the kingdom age is never going to happen, are people who have only studied the New Testament. Now, as it happens, I like the New Testament. I joke about not being allowed to read it, but as an Old Testament professor, I enjoy seeing the way the New Testament fulfills Old Testament promises. I enjoy the way the New Testament completes Old Testament patterns. And if we're looking only at the New Testament, we may come away with the impression that the church is the completion of history. An Old Testament perspective shows us that that is not true, that there is, in fact, a complex historical pattern that is working out according to the plan of God. And I have a cat on my lap. Would anybody like to look at this cat? This is Figaro. Yes, okay, down he goes. I love cats, but maybe not when I'm trying to lecture. So let's see a few of the passages where this kind of stuff works out. Isaiah 2 is a good place. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are the three major prophets, and all of them have a lot of Day of the Lord imagery, but also the minor prophets, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Amos, and others are talking about that day. And the day, of course, is longer than one 24-hour day. It's a time and an era. And that's clear from the passages where it happens. Let's look at the next slide here. This is from Isaiah 2, and the chapter is introduced. Chapter 1 of Jeremiah is talking about judgment. Judgment's going to fall on Israel and on those who trouble Israel. And salvation is the only way out of this. We're going to have to turn our hearts around and follow the Lord. And chapter 2 looks all the way to the end. It shall come to pass in the latter days. Well, when are the latter days? The end days, the end of time, the end of history. The Hebrew talks about the what would be a good the days immediately preceding the arrival at the destination. So if you're let's say you're on a camel caravan, and you're crossing the desert and it's taking 6 months to cross this big desert, there are waypoints along the way usually one day's journey apart. From any given waypoint, the leader of the caravan knows where the next waypoint will be, and his intention is to lead his caravan to that next waypoint. Uh, Several days before you arrive at the destination, there are specific waypoints that begin counting down uh, how we're doing. And this is the image that's brought up here. In the latter days, near the end of the journey, we're going to see the waypoints changing. Okay, so it shall come to pass in the latter days. Here's one of the things that will be happening at the end, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. Okay, the mountain of the house of the Lord, the Temple Mount, yes. Mount Zion is actually different, but we sometimes interchange them. The idea of Jerusalem and the temple is obviously uh, in view here. So there's going to be a time when the Temple Mount, the mountain of the house of the Lord, will be the highest of the mountains and be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. So we're going to have the picture here is of a central role in a historical period for the city of Jerusalem and thus for the people of Israel. And all the nations will be flowing up to Jerusalem. And the passage goes on to hear the Messiah proclaim Torah, the principles of God's blessing. And all of the nations will come up to hear this and go back to build successful societies in their own places. This is built upon redemption, of course. In order to fulfill the law of God, only a redeemed people is capable. So our redeemed people are going to go out and uh, uh, colonize, establish, do whatever, a new earth with Christ as the king. Kind of an amazing picture. And it's definitely not a prediction of the church, because the church is not Jerusalem. The church isn't called to sit in one place and wait for the nations to come to it. We're called to go from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and to the othermost parts of the earth. We're called to go out. Where this picture is of everyone coming in to Jerusalem. So it hasn't happened yet. But this is in the latter days. It's interesting. Let's see what else Isaiah does there in chapter 2. He's again talking about the day of the Lord. For the Lord of hosts has a day. Okay, there's the day of the Lord. And you notice that the phrases are different every time, but the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan. Wait a minute. There in the beginning of chapter 2, Isaiah is talking about a time of blessing, where all the nations come up to Jerusalem and everybody has a wonderful attitude, and they're building a society that is blessed. And here in verse 12, there is a prediction of a day of judgment. So this day, this last day's episode, seems to consist of a blessing and a curse, or curse and blessing, your choice of the sequence there. Uh, the day of the Lord appears to be a time of curse and blessing. A curse for some, blessing for others. This is, in fact, the biblical pattern. Deuteronomy has Moses saying to the people of Israel, and so I set before you this day a curse and a blessing. If you reject the Lord and walk away from Torah, a curse. But if you walk with God and seek to be a blessing by following Torah, a blessing to you and to all who are around you. There's this fundamental distinction. Now, here, all that is lofty, proud and lofty, those who are lifted up, the proud, and they will be brought low against Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan. Well, Lebanon, the oaks of Bashan, why are we picking on Lebanon? Failed state there on the Eastern Mediterranean. I feel badly about Lebanon. They were actually a very metropolitan or cosmopolitan place. People from all over the world would go to Beirut for business and pleasure. It was a beautiful city until the Palestinian Liberation Organization, so-called, decided to take over Lebanon. Now, the ruling power there is called Hezbollah. I think it means the hammer of God. Hezbollah is just one more terrorist organization supported by Iran. Not good. Lebanon is going to be in trouble at the end time. Bashan is Syria. Bashan is actually the hill country on the western fringes of what is today known as Syria and parts of Jordan. But Bashan, the oaks of Bashan, against all those oaks. Well, who are the oaks? it it doesn't really matter. What matters is their location. And we'll come back to that. It's interesting how often when the so-called bad guys of the end time are listed and named, places like Lebanon and Syria come up. And I'll show you why that is important as we move along just a little further. Let's look over in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 46, and this is winding up Jeremiah's message of judgment. And he says, that day is the day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, to avenge himself on all his foes. The sword shall devour and be sated, and drink its fill of their blood. Ooh, that's ugly. The day of the Lord God, a day of vengeance, speaks of a final act of revenge or judgment. The word vengeance needs to be understood in its ancient Near Eastern context. We sometimes say, well, don't take vengeance on people. That's not a nice thing to do, which is probably true in English and in the Western language. In the Eastern language, the concept of vengeance is the repayment of a debt that is owed. When people have done evil, they have earned a vengeful response. And that vengeance becomes an obligation. So God is obligated to repay evil with judgment. The sword shall devour. And it's actually not the sword doing the devouring. The sword will be in the hands of a conqueror. Jeremiah is predicting a day far in the future when those who oppose the Lord will, in fact, pay the price for their error. The sword will devour. And this will happen not by a bolt out of the blue, by thunder and lightning and earthquakes, messing things up, but by actual armies on the ground, rolling into the conquered place and devouring. Warfare is an ugly, bloody, disgusting business. Anyone who's ever had to do that recognizes this. War is never something that we want to go into lightly, and certainly never something that we should look forward to. Christians ought to be known for their peaceful outlook. Nevertheless, having said all of that, and I believe it firmly, the history of the world will end in a terrible sequence of wars. Jesus says you're going to hear about wars and rumors of war. If you keep an eye on the news online, you're going to find that there's an awful lot of war going on right now. Big question people always ask when we get into this. Jesus says wars and rumors of wars. How can we tell when there are enough? And the answer, of course, is we can't. We don't know. It's something that will continue accelerating and becoming more and more prominent part of life until the end is completed, and we don't know when that will be. And we probably shouldn't try to predict it, just that way. Let's look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel is another of the major prophets, and he brings up this particular notion a lot. Thus says the Lord God, disaster after disaster. Behold, it comes. An end has come. The end has come. It has awakened against you. Behold, it comes. Your doom has come to you, O inhabitants of the land. The time has come. The day is near, a day of tumult and not of joyful shouting on the mountains. Okay, so here's a day that the Lord predicts of disaster and of doom, of tumult, and not of joyful shouting. Ezekiel goes on, and we're going to see Ezekiel speaking of the end time events as they relate to the land of Israel, to the nations surrounding. It's a very important book for that. And we're going to spend some time with Ezekiel, but not this day. It is not this day, as they say. Okay, key range of ideas in the day of the Lord is two things. There's judgment and blessing, but there's a distinction between God's judgment against the Gentile nations and God's judgment against Israel. There are two different things going on there. They're similar in that it's all judgment, but really quite different because the Gentile nations are going to have to be defined and understood and identified historically. And that's not always completely clear. Israel, we know who Israel is. As long as we believe that Israel continues to be Israel and not the church, we can make sense of the day of the Lord judgments against Israel. If Israel has become the church, then it's real hard to make any sense of those judgment passages. But again, these are some of the reasons that I approach the Old Testament particularly from a dispensational point of view. I believe that Israel and the church are two different things. And that the church doesn't fulfill Israel's promises. There are some promises that we don't want. And the judgment against Israel includes promises that we certainly don't want. At the same time, there is a promise of blessing on Israel and further on the nations, including those Gentile nations that are judged, which is a very interesting thing, and a conversion of those nations. The people of Babylon and of Egypt will come up to Jerusalem to worship. Well, how's that going to happen? Well, I don't know. And I hope that uh, while we're in heaven, perhaps we get to tune in on the nightly news of what's going on in the world. I would love to see the nations turning to Christ. That's what missionaries are into. That's what's exciting about the ministry. But to see it actually be fulfilled, wow! And more than that, all of creation. There is a redemption of creation itself, the heavens and the earth, that happens in this time that we call the day of the Lord. So there is both curse and blessing. It's not merely the day of judgment, but also the day of culmination for the kingdom program of God. And everything comes together. So let's start off with the judgment on the Gentile nations. And I've got to introduce something here that I know sounds Islamophobic and anti-immigrant and racist and whatever. But I'm going to suggest the phrase round up the usual suspects, which actually comes from an old movie. Well, what is it? My goodness, it's a long time ago now. It's 80 years ago, 85 years ago. Humphrey Bogart and some other famous actors. What was the name of the actress? I can't remember. I think she's probably blonde and Swedish. Um, I can't remember. Ingrid Bergman? Yeah, Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman. Long time ago. And both of those and everybody else is already dead long since, but called Casablanca. And the police lieutenant in charge of Casablanca, the magistrate, is Louis, uh, police officer Louis Renault. He's a wonderful character played by Claude Rains. I really like him. Uh, and at the beginning of the movie, there's apparently the murder of some German agents on the train to Casablanca, and word gets to Casablanca, and police officer Louis says, "Round up the usual suspects," and so his policemen go out and round up all of the suspicious characters they can find, none of whom have any reason to get arrested. At the end of the movie, Colonel Strasser, the German commander of Casablanca, has been shot, and Humphrey Bogart is the one who has just shot him at the airport as everybody is trying to escape. And when the policemen show up at the airport in their squad car, uh, 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 Lieutenant Renault tells them to round up the usual suspects. Okay, well, the usual suspects, I think, is a pretty good term for the consistent group of nations that are repeatedly mentioned in prophecy as the enemies of Israel. This begins with the book of Genesis. People say, well, how come everything starts in Genesis? Well, Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and so we should look there for the beginning of major themes. And this is one of those, particularly Abraham. It actually begins before then, but with Abraham, we start seeing actual names and faces, and it starts to work out. So Ishmael is the son of Abraham and is a rival for Isaac. Isaac is a child of promise. Ishmael is the child who did not receive the promise. Ishmael, in order to irritate his parents, went off into the east and married women of the desert tribes. who were idolaters. So Ishmael became an idolater. Ishmael became a polygamous enemy of Israel. Later on, we see Lot and his two daughters, whom he committed incest with to produce Ammon and Moab. Later on, we're going to see others. The history of these Middle Eastern nations is predicted in the Old Testament. It is demonstrated in the Old Testament. And those same nations are often at war with, or at least in open hostility to Israel. And there's a consistent group of them. When we talk about God's judgment on the nations, we often think about all the Gentiles, every nation on earth. So we think, well, I guess God must be judging Sri Lanka and Australia and Canada and Japan and all of the nations, Chile and South Africa. Everybody is in on this. But that's not necessarily so. The Bible specifically names and traces the history of a set of nations who are singled out for their specific hatred of Israel. Now, at the end times, there's going to be a separation. Jesus says in Matthew 24:5, there's going to be a separation of sheep and goats. That's not individuals, but nations based on their treatment of the nation of Israel, how they vote in the United Nations, for example. The other day there was yet another big vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations to condemn Israel for something. Condemn Israel for its colonization of the Arab lands that they're living on, something to that effect, and to condemn the continuing war of genocide against the peaceful Arabs who live in Gaza. And what was it? 297 to 3 in favor of holding up that particular resolution. It's very consistent. Most of the nations on the face of the earth hate Israel because here is a little people who's different from everybody else, who has been consistent in working hard and performing well on secular standards, and who refuses to be destroyed in spite of the best efforts of some of the most evil people on the planet, and are still there in spite of all their efforts. The nation of Israel continues to exist, even though it shouldn't exist. And everybody wants it to stop. And you've got all these nations who are lined up against Israel. I think that's included. But in the Old Testament, there is consistently, over and over again, a specific list of nations who are singled out for special mention in the day of the Lord. I call these folks the usual suspects. And I'll get a little further in that later on, that it doesn't always mean the whole world, hardly ever. Okay, sometimes the judgment on the nations looks at something historical, something that's already a past event. For example, Isaiah 9:4, the famous Emmanuel passage of the Old Testament, is on also found as mention of the Battle of Gideon against the Midianites. And the Midianites were, frankly, one of the Ishmaelite tribes who inhabited the eastern desert. And there's a bunch of them, the Midianites and the Amalekites, and a whole bunch of others who are descendants of Ishmael or descendants of other of the Genesis tributary tribes. And here Isaiah says, there will be rejoicing as at the defeat of Midian. Well, when did that happen? That 1,000 years before, well, okay, not quite so far, about 500 years before, at the time of the judges. And Isaiah looks back to that. Sometimes we see that kind of thing. There's a historical review of a previous judgment that has already happened. Sometimes the prophets predict the fall of a specific nation. So Jeremiah, at the end of the book of Jeremiah, 50:31, predicts specifically the fall of Babylon. And the details listed there are historically fulfilled with the destruction by Persia. And you see this, the doom on Babylon. Now, Babylon is also a central player in the end time events. So the prediction of the destruction of Babylon in Jeremiah 50:31 probably is a foretaste of what is to come. There will continue to be a Babylon player. We'll talk about that later, but there will continue to be a Babylon character all the way to the end of time. But sometimes the prophets predict a specific fall of a specific nation, which is then historically verified. When we read the history of the period, sometimes that history is biblical. That means it's actual later reading of the Bible shows that this exactly happened. The Ammonites, modern nation of Jordan, their fall is predicted in Ezekiel 21, verse 29. And in fact, the Ammonites fell to the encroaching Persians under the circumstances that are mentioned there. The fall of Tyre in Ezekiel 26 really happened the way Ezekiel describes it there. And so those things are in the past. And the important thing for us as we understand how to read biblical prophecy is to see that the prophecies are historically verifiable. These things actually happened the way they're described, or allowing for poetic license. These things happened the way they were described. Another element of this that we see in the major prophets is the so-called oracles about the nations. So Isaiah 13 through 23, look at 11 chapters. Some would stop at chapter 22. I go to 23. 13 to 23, and a long list of the nations. So there's a judgment on this one, a judgment on that one, a judgment on the one over here, and another one over there. Okay, and we would expect that there would be some consistency among these lists, and in fact, there is. Jeremiah 46 to 51, long section. Ezekiel 25 to 35, long list of specific oracles of condemnation against the nations. Now, which nations are we talking about? If we look at all of those nations lists, and I think it's a good exercise. I don't recommend it as a typical devotional reading, but take a look at those nations that are identified. You're going to find two circles, a close circle and a larger circle. The close circle around Israel, if we were to start just to the north, we're going to find Lebanon. If we move just to the east of Lebanon, we're going to find Syria or the Arameans of Damascus. Move a little south and you'll find Jordan or Ammon. The Ammonites centered around the capital city, which is not too strangely, Amman, is the modern version of the Ammonites. A little farther south, also in what is modern Jordan, the Moabites, the Edomites. Move a little farther south from there, and you're going to find the Saudi Arabian desert, together with all of the principalities. If we move south and west, we're going to find Egypt and also the subcategory of Kush, which is Libya. So from North Africa all the way around to Arabia, the minor states of the Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon, we see a circle. Well, actually, a semicircle. There's the Mediterranean, kind of stops the surrounding, but a surrounding circle in a close level of nations who are historically hostile to Israel. They're typically smaller nations, except for Egypt, perhaps. Libya has to be thought of as a small nation, just a few cities close to the sea. Egypt is a larger population. There is beyond that a larger circle. If we start in the northwest, we're going to find Turkey, which has traditionally been an enemy of Israel. They were the home of the Hittites, who in general were an enemy. Later on, things changed. It became a place where the Assyrians had their control. Turkey. We move uh, uh, east from Turkey, and we're going to find Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is modern Iraq. And Iraq and Mesopotamia in general has had a tremendous history. Is best known as Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and all of that. The name Babylon for the city of Babylon and for the Iraqi plain centered around the Tigris and Euphrates River goes all the way back to the very beginning. The most commonly used city name in the Bible is, not surprisingly, Jerusalem, with well over 1,000 uses. The second most commonly identified city in the Bible is Babylon. It is used about 270 times, so roughly a quarter as many times. The nearest competitor after that is Jericho, with about 26 or 28 mentions. Other city names like Rome, for example, is used 3 or 4 times. There are others that are not used at all. Outside of Israel, very few cities. So how did I get to there? So Babylon. Further east is the modern nation of Iran, also called Persia. If you look at the nations just north of Persia and north of Mesopotamia, from Azerbaijan to all of the stands, the Uzbekistans, the Kazakhstans, the Turkestan or Turkmenistan, all of what is commonly called the stands from Afghanistan all the way around to um, Azerbaijan, was once known as Scythia, or the tribal regions of the Scythians. When we move toward the south, we're going to see the whole Arabian Peninsula. When we move on toward the west, we're going to see North Africa. This is this larger circle encloses a smaller circle. Those are the nations that are specifically identified in the oracles on the nations. Or so we're not going to find South Africa. We're not going to find Somalia. Well, we won't find Tristan da Cunha or any of the other little places that exist on the earth. Now, does that mean that the United States and Brazil don't come under judgment? No, it doesn't really. But there's a special way in which these nations that surround Israel are important in her history. And we have to remember that the end times events are always going to be specifically with reference to Israel. That, among other things, implies that Israel will continue to exist to the end of time. Now, that's an important recognition. At the end of time, as described in the Bible, Israel is still there, being a thorn in the flesh of a surrounding group of nations. Now, there are three characteristics of the group that I call the usual suspects, or the nations in the prophetic literature. One is these are geographically close to Israel. So in order to be a part of the judged nations in the end times event, you have to be a nation that's geographically close. So there are nations like Bangladesh. Okay. Very poor country on the Indian subcontinent. And generally speaking, they vote with many other nations against Israel. So they're historically hostile, but they're not close. Bangladesh is a long way away. They're not going to be involved in the Battle of Armageddon or all of that. So first criterion, geographically close. Secondly, historically hostile to Israel. And by historically, I mean we can trace the hostility to Israel amongst this people group, whatever the name at the time, all the way back into early historical times. So the historic hostility is really, really important. The third characteristic that is obvious by looking at the list is that in modern times, since the 7th century, these nations have been Muslim. And all three have to be true. So there are nations that are close to Israel, for example, Cyprus or Greece, which maybe don't often agree with Israel, but are not Muslim and are not included in the list. There are nations which are far away, Bangladesh, for example, or Indonesia, which are Muslim and are hostile, but aren't close. There are nations that are Muslim that are not hostile and are not close. So not all Muslims are a part of the nations, and not all nations on the planet are even eligible to be a part of the group. I call these the usual suspects. This is one of the notes in a book I read a while ago. Let me see if I can find it here. Joel Richardson and Walid Shoebat. wrote a thing called God's War on Terror. There's some other interesting things going on there, but Walid Shoebat is famous for a challenge that he made. He said, I challenge any of you to look at any of the nations which are specifically mentioned in the oracles of destruction or the predictions of judgment in the end times, which are not today Muslim. And he's right. He's absolutely right. There is something about Islam that is antithetical to Western civilization, and which is peculiarly encouraging of a hatred for Israel. So there's something to understand there. This will also help us understand why Hamas, for example, in Gaza, is willing to literally sacrifice their entire population of a couple of million people on the altar of their hatred for Israel. There's something remarkably evil going on there. Okay, so that's the nations. Now, there's a third element of this day of the Lord that does imply a judgment on all of the earth. Zechariah 12, 3 through 9, speaks of all of the nations who oppose Jerusalem. And the term all in Jeremiah or in Zechariah is really pretty clear. So there will be a judgment on, for instance, Bangladesh, though I think they've already had most of the judgment they're ever going to need. Nevertheless, that will happen. And other nations who vote at the UN to condemn Israel for doing what any of them would do in a heartbeat are going to be condemned at that time. Zephaniah, at the beginning of his prophecy, predicts a judgment on all the earth, kol haaretz, all the earth. Now, all the earth can mean all of the earth that is close to Israel, but I think that's a stretch. The same is true in the New Testament. When we get to Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation, there are some places where the whole earth seems to be implied. So I don't mean by speaking of the usual suspects to deny that the rest of the earth will escape judgment. I think it will be part of that, and it's fairly clear in the prophets. It's debatable in a lot of places, like many things are. But the focus is always going to be Jerusalem, Israel, the usual suspects, and the ends of the earth. A kind of a play out in a different way of the mandate to take the gospel to the whole world. God's judgment is going to start in the house of the Lord, but then will expand to the whole earth. The timing of this end judgment is often debatable. Some of it had already occurred or would soon come when the prophet made his prophecy. The destruction of the Midianites had already happened years before. The fall of Memphis in Egypt had already happened years before when Isaiah describes it. Some had already occurred or would soon come. Some probably have happened in historical times. There are a lot of prophecies that had not occurred by the time the prophet wrote, but occurred within several hundred years. And we can point to specific ones. It's not terribly important. There are some, as you walk through these, that are obviously yet to come. When we compare the description of the judgment of a place and we look at it from a literal point of view, it's obvious that that judgment hasn't happened to this place yet. And a judgment that has been predicted but hasn't happened is yet to come. It's a part of the end time set of events. The character of this thing is, as we're looking at all of the different kinds of judgment that come down, mostly what we see is the effect of war or disease or a combination of the two. The terrible stuff happening in Gaza right now, and I don't discount this. The suffering of the Arab people in Gaza is genuinely terrible. So is the suffering of the people of Israel. The effects of war can be the direct effect of explosions and hand-to-hand combat. Those are terrible. The long-term effect of a war is disease, starvation, displacement, exile. These are all bad. Uh, there aren't very many good things that result from a war. And no one should go lightly into any war, and no one should rejoice when a war happens. War is a terrible thing. But that seems to be the core of the imagery that we see. The second element of this, as we're looking at the character of this end time judgment, is that the process seems to intensify. It seems to accelerate. So the wars get bigger and they come closer together as the end approaches. Specifically, this will be the wars that are related to Israel and Jerusalem and the surrounding nations. And then finally, Daniel, Ezekiel, to a lesser extent, Isaiah in the Old Testament, and then the book of Revelation in the New Testament predicts one great war of the Gentiles attacking Israel over the fate of Jerusalem, brings us to the end of the age. Because in the midst of that war, Messiah himself will set foot on the earth and destroy the attacking armies and set up his throne in Jerusalem over all the world. That's the picture that we see there. When we see wars playing themselves out to a tragic end, that's not the war of the end time. There will be one great war, Gentiles versus Israel, over the fate of Jerusalem, and that will be the end of the age. Are we there yet? Paul says no. We'll look at that when we get to New Testament understanding. But I'm going to leave you with one specific principle that we're going to have to hammer on over and over and over again. This is literal interpretation. Literal interpretation means we take the words on the pages of Scripture to mean what they would normally mean. We're looking at Scripture. So what does Babylon mean? Well, Babylon is the city and the region, a specific people group. Today, this is Iraq. The city Babylon of the end time may have some symbolic characters, but it doesn't magically become Rome, for example. That isn't one of the possibilities. Is it part of the Middle East? Yes, I think obviously. That's scripture. History is the other thing we need to be interpreting literally. A careful understanding of the events of history since biblical times is absolutely essential for understanding how history continues to play out. I don't believe that every event of history is a fulfillment of a particular biblical prophecy. I think it's a mistake most of the time to have your news site in one window and your Bible in the other window on your computer, and look for a one-to-one comparison. Generally, that doesn't work out, but the broad strokes of history ought to fulfill the broad strokes of scriptural prophecy. And that, in fact, is what we're seeing in modern history. And I'm going to show you how some of that plays out when we get back together next week. Next week, we'll continue this this study of the day of the Lord with a look at God's judgment against Israel and the Jewish people in general. Again, kind of a sad thing. The people of Israel are some of the hardest people in the world to reach with the gospel, but they are reachable, and God makes that clear. Okay, why am I not showing up here? You know, I hate it when that happens. Pick into the. Can I do this? There I am. Uh-oh, different. Am I coming in on a different camera? This is really strange. Okay, it is pointed at me from a different direction. Okay, this is really on. Anyway, let's unmute. I'm going to let you go now. Next week we're going to go farther into this whole thing. We're going to understand this a little farther along. I hope this is helpful. I know we're way down in the weeds on this one. You're just going to have to bear with me for another couple of sessions. Then we're going to go back out and take a look at some of the rest of the Old Testament, then on into the New Testament. And you'll see how this all plays out. If you have questions, be sure and hit me with a Facebook Messenger, and I'll try and get back to you on that. Okay. God bless everybody. Love you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Good
everyone.
job. Loved it.
Ciao,
See you
ciao.
soon. Ciao, ciao. Yeah, ciao a tutti. Bye-bye. Let's see if I can find my button here. Brother Joel, I see you there. All right. Bye-bye.